It is one of the greatest murder mysteries of the 20th century. In 18 months, 13 women die for no other reason than being home alone when a killer comes to their door. Each is strangled with a stocking or cord knotted in a bow around their neck. The signature of a killer the papers call the Boston Strangler. But who is he? Many believe it is this man, Albert DeSalvo, even though he was never arrested by police or charged by prosecutors, judged by headlines, but never a jury. Still, the reason to believe he did it, argue some, is contained in a confession that DeSalvo taped in 1965. But was DeSalvo's confession a hoax? If so, why did he want people to believe that he was the Boston Strangler? And why is the case still open? Albert DeSalvo is widely believed to be the Boston Strangler, the most famous killer since Jack the Ripper, a man likened to Manson, Bundy, and Dahmer.
He was an extraordinary character, but basically he had a facile attitude about him. He could manipulate people. He could smile at you and you would say, this person is nonviolent, he's a nice guy. And for many people, that's the last impression they had before a silk stocking went around their neck.
F. Lee Bailey has always maintained his client's guilt.
Is there any doubt in your mind that Albert DeSalvo is the Boston Strangler and did indeed kill 13 women in the greater Boston area?
No, there's no doubt in my mind, and I doubt that there's any real doubt in the minds of any of the public officials who know enough about the case to have a legitimate opinion.
And Albert DeSalvo was
But others, then and now, don't believe it. A generation later, the families of Albert DeSalvo and one of his alleged victims want to find the truth.
In the quest for power, people will do anything, including but not limited to closing the book and pretending that a crime has been solved when in fact it hasn't, and letting murderers go free. What's amazing to me as a human being, as a woman, is that the Boston Strangler, or some of the stranglers, plural, are still out there.
It all began in Boston on a beautiful summer day on the 14th of June, 1962, back when the skyline was more befitting a small town than a city, and people knew nothing of something so evil as a serial killer who walked these streets in search of victims. The first murder occurred near Symphony Hall on a night the orchestra played Bach. Normally, Anna Slessers would have been there, but tonight she had other plans. After freshening up with a bath, she was going to meet her son for dinner and attend a memorial church service. It was a perfect day, and so far, a perfect evening, until someone came to the door. An hour later, Anna Slessers was dead. When her son discovered what had happened, he called police. One of the first at the scene was Dana Kuhn of the Boston Police Crime Lab.
I can see it today. Anna Slessers was spread-eagled on the kitchen floor right by the bathroom. The bathtub was filled to the top with water.
Jim Mellon, then a 28-year-old Boston police officer, was also there.
The streaks of blood from her hair went across the threshold leading to the bathroom, which indicated the fact that she was pulled out by her feet.
Her bathroom cord is wrapped in a bow around her neck, but it wasn't used to kill her. An autopsy revealed she was strangled by hand. The bow is a grim decoration added afterwards. There is no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. A key question is, how did the killer get in? In Boston, spring turns to summer. The days are warm and pleasant. But after the sun goes down, Boston is a different city. In the next 4 weeks, 3 more elderly single women are strangled and sexually molested,
The biggest similarity was the spreading of the legs and the positioning of the bodies, so that when you first entered the room, that this is the site that you were hit with. That seemed prevalent in most of them.
Nothing about the victims points to a motive, nor does anyone know why the strangler leaves a ligature around each woman's neck.
Sometimes you couldn't see it because it was so tight around the neck. It would be kind of embedded in where the skin would fold over it, and you'd only see the knot area or see an area off to the side. It was almost like a post-mortem type of injury added on.
The police have little to go on. It is an era before modern scientific investigation. Cops work a beat on foot, track down leads, and ask questions. It is paper and pencil work. At the crime lab, the most expensive item is a $200 microscope. DNA testing is unheard of. The killer leaves no fingerprints or blood at the crime scene. Cops rely on instincts, tip-offs, and lucky hunches. Two of the best, John Donovan and Ed Sherry, head the case. They know murder and Boston inside and out.
Eddie Sherry had the map of Ireland in his face, and he was one of the best I ever came across, the flattest feet I ever saw. He was the absolute personification of a good cop.
In Boston, the press has yet to make much of the 4 murders until a young reporter named Loretta McLaughlin takes on the story.
And I walked up to the city editor, Jack McLean, and said, "Hey, Jack, summertime, things are quiet. How about letting me do some work on these murders?" He said, "Oh, why?" He said, "Those women are nobodies." And I said, "But that's just it, Jack. Why would anyone go around killing 4 nobody women?"
In August, McLaughlin writes a 5-part series about the murders.
And the day the 5th article ran, predicting that there was a single killer, I named him the Boston Strangler, and that he would strike again, the 5th body was found.
She adds a terrifying dimension to the murders by naming the killer the Boston Strangler. Though the police are not certain it's one killer, the idea puts added pressure on homicide chief John Donovan.
Well, it was the roughest time I ever had in my 33 years in the police department. Work without days off or vacations and so forth.
In an overall mood of fear, no one is above suspicion. Neighbors turn in neighbors.
I mean, they were looking for a guy with his hair sticking straight out, with bloodshot eyes and fangs out about an inch from his mouth, the Boston Strangler.
By December, Boston is getting ready for Christmas. No harm has come to anyone since August. It appears the killing spree is over. But Boston isn't that fortunate, and neither are the women who live here. On December 5th, the Strangler strikes again. The victim is Sophie Clark, a 20-year-old medical technician. As 1962 ends, 6 women are dead, and there's little else police know except how they got that way.
Basically, we figure that he would say, take him into the bathroom a lot most of the time, and then he'd grab him from behind with his arm around their neck, render him unconscious, not dead, and then do whatever he was going to do, perhaps sexually at that time and sometimes later, and then at the end, before he'd leave, he'd put the material around their neck and actually strangle them till they were dead.
3 weeks later, on New Year's Eve, a 7th woman is murdered, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett. Then, 4 more. The newspapers report hard facts mixed with speculation to a frightened city glued to the story.
Women in the city at the time were terrified. I mean, they wouldn't let you in the door. They probably wouldn't let their husbands and family in the door unless they slipped identification cards underneath. I mean, locksmiths had did a tremendous business. There was a sense of fear throughout the town. They happened with sufficient regularity that women were constantly reminded.
By late November, it happens again. There is no grace, no break from the murders. Even on a day of national mourning, there is another strangling in Boston. After 18 months, there are 12 unsolved murders. 1963 ends amid a public outcry that reaches to the State House. Boston begins 1964 in grief. The death of President Kennedy is a painful memory. Lost is so much promise. But the world goes on. For 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, there is much to look forward to. After sharing Christmas with her family, she's going to move to her own apartment in Boston.
She came to spend Christmas with us, and we were all home at the time, and we just had so much fun. And she said she had to get back. She had to get back because she had to move. And I kept trying. There were like 3 times, come on, Mary, come on and stay. We're having so much fun. Please, come on and stay. No, I have to get back. I have to pack. And I said it again, maybe 4 hours later, and I said it one more time, and I thought, the heck with you. If you want to go, go ahead. And I thought, too bad I didn't try one more time.
At her Boston apartment, Mary unpacks and writes a letter home. It reaches her sister Diane a few days later. Diane is happy to read her sister's letter, but her intuition tells her something is wrong.
The day was beautiful, but it just didn't feel like a good day, and I couldn't figure out why. It's just a perfect day. And it was a great letter. Then it was later on that day that I heard the news. My father had gotten the phone call from the Boston Globe. Still no Boston police. And the Boston Globe asked my father, do you have a daughter, Mary Ellen Sullivan? And there were 6 of us, and during confirmation, you get to change your middle name. So, of course, my father couldn't keep track of 4 girls, so he said, no, I don't have a daughter, Mary Ellen, I have a daughter, Mary Ann. And my mother got up and just said, what hospital is she in? And my father just couldn't talk and shook his head.
Her murder is the most gruesome to date.
There was a ligature wrapped around her neck, 2 scarves and a stocking. And the killer had decorated the crime scene. We know that she was sexually assaulted with a broomstick, and the killer left a Happy New Year's card between her toes.
Mary Sullivan isn't just another victim who did not deserve to die. She is everyone's little sister. She is young, Irish, and Catholic. She is Boston, and she lives only blocks from the State House. Mary Sullivan's murder and the 12 unsolved murders before hers turned Boston's grief to rage. Spurred on by a media frenzy, the public demands justice. A matter for the police becomes an issue for politicians. At the State House, Attorney General Ed Brooke is the top law enforcement official in Massachusetts. In 1964, he is also America's highest-ranking black politician. Brooke decides to bring the investigation of the biggest murder in Massachusetts history under his jurisdiction. Not only will it quell public fears, but Brooke believes it will advance his career if he forms a single statewide effort. So far, 13 murders have occurred in 5 different police jurisdictions across the state, and investigators have refused to work together.
Everybody wants to be the hero and make the pinch. It was the self-satisfaction from other officers that would say, oh, gee, he made a great arrest today. He's the guy that caught the strangler. So every police officer kept little notes. They wouldn't divulge it to the rest. Some of them decided to solve the thing on their own, and this, that, and the other, and wouldn't tell others. So, you know, again, it ended up a political ball game.
13 days after Mary Sullivan's death, Ed Brooke announces the creation of the Boston Strangler Bureau. It is an unprecedented move, but these are fearful times, and the press is relentless.
We did a series, a daily series of 29 consecutive stories, big stories, outlining all the details we could possibly find of all the previous cases, and presented that. And actually, that series was part of the public opinion, the force of public opinion that pressed Attorney General Brooke into forming the commission to find the Boston Strangler.
Brooke appoints John Bottomley, a top state official and real estate lawyer, to organize the myriad details of the case. Though Bottomley has no experience in criminal investigations, he is considered a good administrator.
One of the most important aspects of these investigations is to eliminate situations and people.
The Strangler Bureau amasses hundreds of volumes of material on the case. The data is organized to find a common denominator in the murders. The Bureau even reinvestigates each strangling. A local company lends one of its first computers to compile all the data. Still, after 1 year, there is no progress. Stymied, the investigation is willing to try anything, including a psychic named Peter Hurkos.
Somebody whispers in my ear that Eddie Brooke, the Attorney General, has brought a psychic in the case. And my reaction is, you gotta be kidding.
Now, to many of us, ESP may seem like a lot of mumbo-jumbo, like crystal ball gazing, Ouija boards, or tea leaf reading. Perhaps a good subject for television entertainment, but scarcely a means of scientific investigation.
I believe that the people of Massachusetts had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Mr. Hurkos did not cost the Commonwealth any money. He did not impede regular investigation procedure, nor interfere with state or local police. Extraordinary methods of investigation are needed to deal with these highly abnormal and uncommon crimes.
Hurkos is an embarrassment. Claiming the ghosts of the American Revolution are causing too much of a disturbance, he leaves town.
It was part of the circus scenario that any of these serial killer incidents, Hillside Strangler, Boston Strangler, Charles Manson, etc., they breed weird things, and there's no way to stop them from happening. Peter Hurkos was one of those weird things. In retrospect, he never came close to describing the Boston Strangler.
Boston's only consolation is that the stranglings have stopped, with or without the help of Brooke, Bottomley, or the Strangler Bureau. But while the murders have ceased, the saga continues. The next episode includes F. Lee Bailey, a rising young defense attorney, and a revelation that stuns Boston. 1965. As investigators pore over the murders, a rising legal star appears on the scene. He is 32-year-old F. Lee Bailey. His brilliant defense overturned the conviction of Sam Shepard, a Cleveland doctor jailed for murdering his wife.
Lee Bailey was one of the best lawyers I've ever seen in terms of preparation. Some people consider him the greatest cross-examiner in legal history. Nothing was going to come up in a criminal prosecution that he wasn't prepared for.
Back in Boston, he is the defense attorney for a convicted killer named George Nassar. Nassar is undergoing psychiatric evaluation at Bridgewater, a facility for the criminally insane, for another murder that could land the 25-year-old in the electric chair.
My recollection is George Nassar was holding up a gas station. There's a teenage attendant. The robbery occurs. He threatens the attendant. The attendant goes to his knees, pleading not to be hurt. And Georgie blows him away.
police include Nasser among a long list of Strangler suspects. But like the others, they have no evidence. But it is Nasser's new cellmate who will attract the attention of the Strangler investigation. His name is Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo, a 31-year-old fix-it man, married with 2 children, is under arrest for rape in a case police refer to as the Green Man, so called because the assailant wears a green custodial jumpsuit.
He came to the door and told you you were entitled to something you didn't think you were entitled to, and you couldn't wait to let him in. The landlord says, we're required to paint your apartment every 3 years, and here we are, and I have color charts here. If you'd like a different color, it'll be professionally painted. Come right in.
DeSalvo is supposed to be in jail, but he's conned his way into Bridgewater after claiming to hear voices and see visions. The accommodations are better, but the charges are no less serious. If convicted, he faces 27 years. This is DeSalvo's second arrest. In 1961, he was convicted of sexual harassment as the measuring man.
He went around, he knocked on doors, he told ladies that he had seen them. He thought they could be models. Would they let him measure them? And they did. $40 an hour, he told them, at a time when most people weren't making $4 an hour.
At Bridgewater, Nasser introduces Bailey to DeSalvo, but not to defend him. There's another reason more incredible than anyone could imagine. According to court records, DeSalvo wants to write a book that says he is the Boston Strangler, and he wants Bailey to help him sell it.
And I said, you could certainly do that, and somebody might print it. I said, the problem is the book will put you in the electric chair, so you have to make a choice. If you want to fry badly enough, you can write a book. The long and the short of it was, we found a way around that.
No killer has ever written a book before about a murder they've committed. What was DeSalvo up to? Officer Jim Mellon recalls the reaction of DeSalvo's wife to her estranged husband's plan.
She got on the phone and she said to him, Albert, you've always said there was a gimmick. He was always going to come up with a gimmick and make $1 million and never have to worry again as long as he lived.
Is DeSalvo's claim a hoax? And if so, is it all his idea, or does he have help?
Bailey explained to him, and he used the word Bailey, explained to him that he'd be able to have enough money he'd be able to own a hospital like Bridgewater, something like that, and that he'd have enough money to take care of his family, and there'd be money there that he'd be taking care of us, and one day he could be out on the street again.
If money is one reason DeSalvo says he is the Strangler, another is his personal safety. DeSalvo seems to believe his claim will earn him a bunk in a mental hospital, not a prison cell.
He was terrified of prison. He had had an experience where he had been thrown into a jail cell, where he had been stripped naked, he had been cold, he'd been without food, he'd been hungry, he'd been isolated, he was lonely. He was terrified of going through that again. He wanted to be in a mental institution, and he was led to believe by F. Lee Bailey that he would go to Johns Hopkins University to be studied for the criminal mind.
Whatever grand scheme DeSalvo may have had, his hope of staying in a mental institution or money for his family, the only fact that matters is this: is DeSalvo the real Boston Strangler? Bailey checks with investigators close to the case to scrutinize his client's story.
I was skeptical, and I said, this guy may try to tell me he's the Strangler. Give me some questions where you will know whether the answers could have been fashioned or they had to come from someone at the scene. And they gave me perhaps a dozen questions. And I interviewed this fellow who didn't look like a strangler, didn't act like one. He was very polite, although very muscular. And on the way home from that interview, I called John Donovan, and I said, here are the answers I've got. They don't make any sense to me, but tell me what you think. And as soon as I got through reading the answers, they said, he looks awfully good.
But while some details are accurate, others are not.
He said, as far as Mary Sullivan was concerned, that he left a knife by the body. He didn't. There was no knife. He said that he penetrated Mary and ejaculated. He never did. There was no sperm in the vagina. He also said that he put a woolen sweater over her head, and he didn't. There was no sweater. He got it wrong because he couldn't keep all those details straight that were in the newspaper or that George Nasser gave to him.
Some speculate DeSalvo got his information from the real killer, perhaps George Nasser or someone else. But it's only a guess because no one knows for certain. Only that some of what DeSalvo reports is right and some is wrong. For example, DeSalvo maintains he talked his way into his victims' apartments, saying he was sent by the landlord to fix something. But the evidence doesn't support his story in the Mary Sullivan case.
She had rollers in her hair. And that's another thing. Years ago, if you had known someone was coming to visit you, you'd never be seen in rollers. You'd also never be seen in rollers just opening up the door and letting somebody in. I mean, that was a huge no-no to be seen in rollers.
Or in the case of Anna Slessers.
She would never open the door for anybody. Not her. But Albert says she went to the door and she opened it. She hasn't got her dentures in. She has no underclothing on, just this robe. No way. No way. She's a classy lady.
In spite of DeSalvo's self-confessed claim, no physical evidence links him to the crimes, nor are there eyewitnesses. But given DeSalvo's recall of the crimes, Bailey is certain his client is guilty and convinces investigators to question him to see what they think. With nothing to lose and everything to gain, investigators agree to do so. In March 1965, Bailey informs the media that he is representing a man claiming to be the Boston Strangler and that he is in custody at the Bridgewater House of Correction for the Criminally Insane.
It hit the city like a thunderbolt. It hit the newsrooms like a thunderbolt. Everyone was racing pell-mell to find out everything they could possibly find out. It was just a startling development that the Boston Strangler, who hadn't strangled anyone by this time for more of a year or 2 years, was suddenly appearing alive and in custody. The state had him the whole time.
Soon after, DeSalvo is slated to meet the Boston Strangler Bureau. It has taken F. Lee Bailey months to convince them that he has caught the Strangler.
Albert DeSalvo looked like the guy that just fixed your toilet. And it was that innocuous appearance together with his easy smile that caused many to say, well, this guy couldn't be the Strangler. Indeed, law enforcement got into fistfights over it. Later on in the case, so disappointed were they that they didn't catch Albert DeSalvo. I had to turn him in under conditions where they could never prosecute him for murder. So in some ways, this was an embarrassment to law enforcement.
Bailey's intention of turning DeSalvo into an object of criminal study begins in August 1965. As a heat wave grips the city, the 3 investigators from the Strangler Bureau arrive to question DeSalvo. The interview could have ended months of speculation over the truth of DeSalvo's story, but it does not. It only adds to the controversy when John Bottomley, the head of the Bureau and a real estate lawyer by training, bumps Boston police from the questioning.
And I was ready, and all of a sudden John Bottomley said, before you go in, I want 2 minutes in there with him. And so we couldn't overrule him, so he went in for 2 minutes, and it was at least 2 hours when he came out again.
Bottomley handles the entire interrogation alone for purely political reasons.
He knew that Brooke was going to go for the United States Senate, and he was going to run for Attorney General. And he figured that if he was the only one that had the story, he'd be the one to get on the witness stand. And the publicity and everything would push him into the Attorney General's job.
Bottomley questions DeSalvo over several weeks for 52 hours. Afterwards, Bottomley becomes the leading advocate of DeSalvo's guilt. But no one else ever questions him, and Bottomley keeps the audio tapes from the media and the public, a decision he staunchly defends. Only transcripts are released.
Definitely not. They were not made available to any person. I must say, though, that the district attorneys of the counties in which these murders occurred were given copies of the transcript of related crimes. And also, it should be remembered that counsel for Mr. DeSalvo was given a copy of the transcript, because just as much as it's the property of the Commonwealth, it's the property of Mr. DeSalvo.
The tapes have long since disappeared, but some familiar with the investigation say the reason why they were never made public is because they reveal Bottomley botching the questioning, going so far as to help DeSalvo answer questions that tie him to the crimes.
It was like a softball pitcher. Bottomley would throw the ball up, and if Albert didn't get it one way, he'd throw the ball up again, and it'd come back the third time and say, "Wasn't that the way you mean it?" He'd say, "Sure, that's what I meant."
Flawed or not, Bailey makes sure that his client's confession can never be used against him. The reason? DeSalvo never waived his right against self-incrimination, so whatever he says cannot be used in court.
The only thing I required was you can't kill him. You can study him, you can confine him, you should confine him. I recommended he be sentenced to life imprisonment, but you can't kill him. And that's the deal. And why did they have no chance to prosecute him? Because I was calling those shots.
There is still no evidence to tie DeSalvo to the crimes. His confession is flawed, and his motives suspect. But what really cements DeSalvo's claim to 13 murders is a book.
Gerald Frank was just about to publish a book called The Boston Strangler, which became a bestseller. And he came to me and he said, "Don't tell me they've got the guy, you're ruining my book." I said, "You might want to wait a month or so." And we made a deal that Albert's family, not Albert, and his lawyer to a degree, would get 15% of the royalties that were paid to Gerald Frank.
On June 17, 1966, DeSalvo sells the rights to his life story. As the contract states, quote, "For violations I may have committed," end quote. The price? $15,000 and royalties. Ironically, once the contract is signed, Frank never interviews DeSalvo for his book. Instead, he derives his information from Bailey, Bottomley, Brooke, and others in the Strangler Bureau, not the self-confessed killer.
I believe that F. Lee Bailey organized the book. He was the one who was going into the prison, and according to DeSalvo, whether this is true or false, I don't know, but according to DeSalvo, F. Lee Bailey would come in on a daily basis with a tape recorder.
In November 1966, The Boston Strangler becomes a bestseller. Even though DeSalvo has never been charged with the murders, the book categorically speaks of him as the man who murdered 13 women, but some call the book a work of fiction, not fact.
He called me and he said, "Did you get my book?" And I said, "Yes, thank you." He said, "Did you read it?" I said, "Well, I'll be honest with you, Gerald. I just read Sless's, his description of what happened at Sless's." I said, "And it didn't happen that way," so I closed the book. He said, "So you don't believe it?" I said, "I never did believe him." He said, "Well, Jim, for what it's worth, you're not alone." He said, "But I want you to remember, I had a deadline to keep."
4 months after the book hits the stands, DeSalvo is tried, but not as the Strangler, as the rapist of 29 women. Bailey argues the insanity defense on DeSalvo's behalf, but loses.
Are you disappointed in this
court decision, yes.
Why? You happy to be going back to Bridgewater?
No comment.
DeSalvo is sentenced to 27.5 years to life at Bridgewater, a mental hospital. He may have been able to stay there, but after he escapes a month later, he is recaptured and jailed in a maximum security prison, the last thing he wanted. 6 years later, DeSalvo is ready to talk again. This time, he threatens to tell what he says really happened. After 6 years in prison, nothing has gone DeSalvo's way. Little or no money reaches his family, and the promise of being a crime study in a mental institution, as he had been led to believe, never happens. Now he wants to sell his autobiography to journalist Steve Dunleavy. Dunleavy is the only reporter ever to speak to DeSalvo. His conclusion, after spending 33 days in a jail cell with him, is vastly different from what Bailey or Bottomley claim.
In actual fact, after meeting up with DeSalvo and studying him quite a bit, I was convinced that he was not the Boston Strangler. He was what he boasted to be, a cowardly, big-mouth rapist.
Over the course of Dunleavy's visit, DeSalvo and his longtime friend George Nasser have a falling out. By the time Dunleavy leaves, DeSalvo wants to change his story, but it is too late.
The last visit was when we visited Albert, and he gave me, during the, when we were ready to leave, he grabbed me and gave me a bear hug and everything. That was the only time he ever actually hugged me or anything. And told us things are hot, and he would like us not to visit him until he further let us know, give us notice that he was in fear of something happening. And he was getting ready to go to court, hoping to be able to go to court and speak out about how this all came about and how it started and who was involved in the whole thing. He said it's going to be big.
DeSalvo phones Dr. Ames Roby, the former chief of psychiatry at Bridgewater, and asks to meet with him.
Well, he was going to tell me the real story of the Boston Strangler. Whether this was leaked somehow or what, I don't know. But when I woke up that Monday morning to get dressed and shaved and go on down, I had the news on. And the major news item was that Albert had been killed in the middle of the night.
DeSalvo is murdered in his cell. No small feat in a maximum security prison. The killer or killers had to walk through 6 doors, past guards and other inmates. Yet there are no witnesses. DeSalvo is stabbed 15 times and left to bleed to death. Guards find him the next morning.
When I found that the doors are left open up in the infirmary, no guards are there. They get into his room, and they do this to him, and he had to be there for hours bleeding to death, and nobody's there. And there's other inmates in there, and nobody knows nothing. So that, over the years, that's why right now I'm almost shaking now, because it's just talking about it still bothers me to this day.
No one is ever convicted in DeSalvo's murder. The family requests an autopsy report, but can't get one until Nasser steps in.
I told Nasser, I said, I have no luck with different lawyers. They keep giving me the runaround. So Nasser turned around and he says, oh, gee, that'd be no problem. He says, wait here for a few minutes, I'll be right back. So we were, if I believe we were outside the prison itself, we were in the yard. And he got up, went into the prison. He was out in 5 minutes, and he gave us an autopsy report. And I was devastated when I got that from him.
Now dead, DeSalvo can never be tried as the Boston Strangler. But why wasn't he ever tried at all? And what proof is there that he was the Strangler?
The physical evidence to link him to the crime was his recollection of the physical evidence, which he could only have recalled if he had been there. That's the proof against Albert DeSalvo. The fact that he didn't go through a court trial is not the end of the day. The end of the day is law enforcement said, okay, there's no need to look further for the Boston Strangler. That's what two attorneys general, lots of important and able cops. The public should have confidence they would not have abandoned the search if a dangerous man might still have been out there.
But some doubt that DeSalvo's knowledge of some of the crimes is any proof he was the killer.
I do believe that at least one murder, and I'd be willing to bet a week's pay it, was committed by another individual whom Albert met in prison. And I think that individual gave details to Albert in which would provide a foundation for Albert laying claim to the murder.
The attorney for the DeSalvo and Sullivan families are certain Albert DeSalvo is not the real strangler. The proof, they allege, is that prosecutors never brought him to trial.
How can a man who has confessed to 13 brutal murders involving sexual violation of women never be charged? Ever. And all they needed was probable cause, which is a very, very low standard. Was a crime committed, and did this person that we're about to indict commit the crime? Do we think maybe they did it? That's all probable cause is. It's the lowest standard of proof in the judicial system.
Instead of a court of law, the truth is left to the strangler industry. A year after the best-selling book, Hollywood turned out a movie about it.
The Boston Strangler, very much like Son of Sam, became an industry in Boston. As the industry flourished, you had politicians stepping up to the plate, you had cops being promoted, you had F. Lee Bailey, best ask him, but I think that would have been his first fortune that he made. Obviously, Hollywood had a bonanza. I thought it was a very, very weak movie.
DeSalvo sues the film company, claiming he was not portrayed accurately and that he has received no money for it. They argue in turn that they purchased DeSalvo's rights from Gerald Frank. A judge agrees, and DeSalvo gets nothing. Albert H. DeSalvo was eager to tell the world that he was the Boston Strangler, motivated more by personal gain than conscience. In the end, he gained nothing and lost everything.
Well, obviously, I wish he had never got himself into that there, thinking he was going to make things all right for help everybody else by professing to be the Strangler when in fact he wasn't. Thinking, however he was coached into it or not, to me, I know if he never had done that, he'd probably been on the street today alive.
The words of Albert DeSalvo are all that connect him to the unproven belief that he is the Boston Strangler.
There are many out there. There are many fathers and sons out there that are Albert DeSalvos at a given time. Some idea might be gotten out of what happened to me. If this will help only one, we've accomplished something.
But DeSalvo's words aren't good enough for his family and the families of Mary Sullivan. Now, more than 40 years later, they want the Boston police to turn over DNA evidence so they can conduct their own investigation. The police have refused. The unlikely reason? The cases of Mary Sullivan and other victims of the Boston Strangler are still open because no one was ever brought to trial.
We're just small people in this big city of Boston, in all these government buildings, with all these government people. To me, they're not doing their job. I don't want to be told that. Just open the case up. Who killed her?
At the end of 2001, the families had the bodies of Mary Sullivan and Albert DeSalvo exhumed. After conducting their own tests, experts found that the only foreign DNA on Mary's body was not Albert's. It is yet another indication that DeSalvo may not be the real Boston Strangler.